Miss Adams, can you hear us by any chance? I just wondering.
I can. I can. Sorry
Awesome.
about that. I was muted and couldn't figure out how to unmute, but yes, I can hear you.
Oh, no problem. I was just running a test since you were sitting there. I could talk to you. Thank you.
Perfect. Perfect. Glad to help.
Steve Duran just came on.
Yeah.
Oh. On. Oh, okay. And then when you're done.
And I might have. And that's over 3 years. Yeah, so what it is like those the 3 months. And that's just year over year, decrease or increase, or increase.
Yes, if you go either way. So
Okay.
what was that growth rate from?
Kind of just here, I like that things like this are getting, it feels like more and more open and accessible to people.
Hi, everyone that is online. We are waiting for a few members to come in person. But thank you for waiting.
And that's the only.
Okay. I'm sorry, could somebody say something? I'm not sure I'm hearing anything.
Hi, Mr. Ruiz, it's Ashley. We are just
Okay.
waiting on Member Stratton to join.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I
Thank you.
was seeing the mouse move around and I was like, that's why I logged out. But yeah, I can hear you. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank
And
you.
Member Swanson, we see you as well. And
Hi.
I think, yep, we can hear you as well.
Ashley, a couple of things.
Yes,
I just
Member
want to let
Swanson.
everyone know that I have a unmovable personal conflict that came up, and I need to leave this meeting about 9:45, and then I'll return as soon as I can be done with it. Probably about, I would guess, 11 or so.
Okay, thank you, Member Swanson.
And also, I want to thank Lynn Adams for coming to all these meetings all the time.
Thank you for the shout out.
We are going to go ahead and get started. Member Stratton is going to be logging in momentarily, but I'll go ahead and start with my introduction. So we are going to call this meeting to order. And just as a brief intro on how this meeting will run, we are going to have members providing comment and participating via Zoom and also in person. We also have participants that are able to participate via Zoom or in person. So for each item, what we will do is it will be the item will be presented by board staff. Board members at that point will have the opportunity to ask questions of board staff. And then we will ask the members of the public to come up and provide comments and have further discussion. This is going to be an open discussion, open format, a little bit more informal than what we typically do at our regular board meetings, because we really do want to have that public input if possible. So just as a little bit of housekeeping for members and for participants online, Please stay muted. If you would like to speak when you're called on or when it is appropriate, please raise your hand and we'll make sure to call on you at that time. And for participants that are here in person, please make sure that your microphone is red or off when you're not speaking. And then when you wish to speak, you need to hit the button so that your microphone turns green. And then that goes the same with the podium for those that are in person as well. With that, I'm going to move on to a roll call. Superintendent Designee Miller. Here. Mr. Ruiz.
Here.
Mr. Stratton. Mr. Swanson.
Here.
And we do have a quorum. We are going to move on to the general overview. And that presentation is going to be done by Andrew Leader, and we will do the election of officers at a later time. And members, we do need to take a motion to move that item for the election of the subcommittee chair and vice chair until Mr. Stratton is here. So maybe as a good practice, maybe we move it to after the general overview.
Hi, Ashley. This is Tim. I'm here.
Oh, perfect. Never mind then. Let's go back to the election of subcommittee chair and vice chair. At this time, do we have any members that would like to serve in the chair or vice chair positions?
I would nominate Member Miller as chair. If that's okay.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank you, Member Swanson. I would like to nominate you as vice chair.
Right back at you. I'm good.
And we do need to take that in separate motions to make sure that we have quorum.
I will make a motion.
I'll second the motion from Member Swanson to nominate Member Miller as chair.
Okay.
Mr. Swanson, to make sure it's clear, will you please make a motion?
Yeah, I move to approve Wendy Miller as chair of the subcommittee, the financial framework subcommittee that's currently meeting.
And this is Member Reese. I'll second that.
Mr. Ruiz, how do you vote?
I vote aye.
Mr. Stratton,
I vote aye.
Mr. Swanson,
Aye.
and then Superintendent Designee Miller.
Aye, thank you.
Motion passes. And for vice chair.
I move to approve Member Swanson as vice chair of financial subcommittee.
And I'll second that motion.
Mr. Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Stratton,
Aye.
Mr. Swanson,
Aye.
Superintendent Designee Miller.
Aye.
Motion passes. And now, Ms. Miller, I will pass it off to you to conduct the meeting.
This is what occurs when you come in person, huh? All right, I think we are ready to move on to item D for general overview.
Good morning. In August, the board established the Financial Framework Subcommittee to determine whether changes should be made to the board's framework, focusing on the measures, measure targets, and measure calculations. At this time, 3 subcommittee meetings have been scheduled. Staff anticipates the subcommittee will complete its work during the early part of 2024 and provide its recommendation to the full board shortly thereafter. As noted on this slide, the board's financial framework is used to analyze charter's financial performance and not their processes for managing that performance. It is also used to communicate the board's financial performance expectations and identify those charters showing signs of financial risk. Unlike other organizations that may have established financial benchmarks for their schools, the board, under its financial framework, is ultimately making disciplinary decisions, including revoking charters and closing schools. All final decisions of the board are appealable, including revocation and closure decisions, as charter holders must be afforded due process. In this context, it is necessary that the metrics used under the financial framework fully depict and legally support a financial situation appropriate for revocation and closure, and provide the data to back that decision. The board's framework includes 6 measures. For this presentation, I will not be going over each measure. Instead, additional information about the specific measures has been linked to the slide. Annually, staff determines each charter holder's performance on the 6 measures and assigns the applicable measure rating using information from the audits conducted by independent CPAs and average daily membership calculations completed by the Arizona Department of Education using student attendance data submitted to ADE by the charter holder. Using the charter holder's ratings on the 6 measures, staff assigns the charter holder's summative financial performance rating or overall rating. If a charter holder has 1 or more measures rated below standard, then that charter holder receives an intervention rating and is subject to additional monitoring under the framework's intervention processes. Are there any questions before I discuss characteristics in the financial performance of the board's portfolio? Under the charter law, the board may contract with a public body, private person, or private organization for the purpose of establishing a charter school. For this school year, the board has 414 active charter contracts. 93% of the board's current contracts are with not-for-profit entities. Single site contracts make up 83% of the board's portfolio. Further, 55% of the contracts are considered associated. For expansion eligibility determination purposes, the board has defined an associated charter as a charter operated by a charter holder that contracts with the same education service provider, a charter operated by the same charter holder under a separate contract, or a charter operated by a charter holder with at least 50% of the officers, directors, members, or partners in common, as reflected in the charter contract. Based on primarily fiscal year 2023 attendance data, 1/4 of the board's current contracts have an ADM of 150 or less, and nearly half have an ADM of 300 or less. Please note that this chart does not reflect ADM by schools, but rather ADM by contract. For the 414 contracts currently operating a school, this graph groups the contracts by their ADM and number of years in operation. For this slide, staff used the financial framework's ADM classifications of small, medium, and large instead of the ranges found on the previous slide. Using information from the 22 audits, fiscal year 2022 audits, this slide provides information on charter holders that lease or finance their facilities, as well as other debt the charters may have. The board implemented its current financial framework with the fiscal year 2019 audits, which the board received in fiscal year 2020. A charter holder that receives an overall rating of good standing or adequate standing meets the board's financial performance expectations. Focusing on fiscal year 2019 and fiscal year 2022 performance, this graph identifies the percentage of the portfolio receiving a good standing rating based on the number of years in operation. Focusing again on fiscal year 2019 and 2022.
Andrea,
Yes.
am I allowed to interrupt?
Yeah.
Can you go back a slide? How do you, why is that low for the blue line for the category? Is that just some sort of weird aberration?
That could be part of it. I think also what is contributing to some of the performance in 2022, which is the green line, is with the pandemic, there was also some influx of money. And I think to help schools kind of navigate through all of that uncertainty. And I think that in addition helped bump up those numbers a little higher than they might have been had that not been the case.
Okay, great. Thank you. Go on.
Focusing again on fiscal year 2019 and fiscal year 2022 performance, this graph identifies the percentage of the portfolio receiving a good standing rating based on the framework's ADM classifications. For all years evaluated under the financial framework, the medium classification includes the highest number of contracts. These charters have an ADM between 200 and 599. Are there any other questions before I shift from looking at the portfolio as a whole to looking at those charters that have been identified for financial intervention?
You may have said this, but the choice to spotlight 2019 and 2022 here comparatively, can you just speak to that for?
Yeah. The reason for picking those 2 years was because 2019 was the first year that was evaluated under this current framework, and 2022 is the most recent year that we have available.
Great, thank you.
During the first 4 audit cycles, the number of charter holders receiving an intervention rating under the framework has declined, as has the number of charter holders placed on probation after receiving 2 or more consecutive intervention ratings. From fiscal year 21 to fiscal year 2022, the number of charter holders receiving a first-time intervention rating increased, but continued to remain below prior year levels. For those charter holders that received intervention ratings, this graph identifies the reason for the rating, which may be a specific measure being rated below standard or multiple measures being rated below standard. Over the past 3 fiscal years, 26 charter contracts have either been surrendered under duress, or revoked. If a charter contract was surrendered under duress, this means the charter holder decided to surrender the contract in lieu of the board proceeding with the revocation process or other disciplinary actions. The reasons cited for the closures varied from management or the organization no longer being able to operate the school to operational noncompliance. Of the 26 charters that closed during the past 3 fiscal years, 14 or over half closed for financial reasons. 4 of the 14 surrendered their contracts under duress after the charter holders were placed on probation under the financial framework and assigned to the highest risk level. The remaining 10 contracts cited low enrollment as the reason for the closure. For the 13 contracts that had submitted at least 1 audit to the board, 8 had received an intervention rating based on the last audit submitted. When considering the last 2 audits, 6 of those 8 had received an intervention rating for 2 consecutive years. At the time of closure, about 1/3 had been in operation for 3 or fewer years, and another 1/3 had been in operation for 21 or more years. Further, about 2/3 served 60 or fewer students in their final year. To determine the ADM trend identified on this slide, staff looked at the charter's ADM for the 3 most recent fiscal years, if applicable. The remainder of this presentation outlines the subcommittee's anticipated work. During its meeting, the subcommittee will be reviewing all 6 framework measures. This will be the first time the measures have been reviewed since the board approved these measures in December 2018. Staff has previously not brought proposals to the board regarding the measures to allow for multiple years of performance data and feedback to be collected, as well as to avoid knee-jerk or piecemeal responses. The experience, data, and feedback obtained from multiple audit cycles provides the foundation to now evaluate the measures and whether they accurately and fairly capture charter holders' financial performance and target the board's resources and efforts on those charters most financially at risk. The remaining slides identify certain items that the subcommittee will consider based on data and lessons learned from the last 4 audit cycles, stakeholder feedback, and the recommendations made to the board in the Auditor General's recent performance audit and sunset review. Previously received written stakeholder feedback is available through the link on this slide. Later on today's agenda, the subcommittee will be discussing the going concern and default measures. The subcommittee will also be considering today proposed changes to the formula used for calculating charter holders' unrestricted days liquidity, as well as a proposal to increase over multiple audit cycles the number of days liquidity charter holders must have. At a future meeting, the subcommittee will be considering changes to the adjusted net income measure, which are identified on this and subsequent slides. At a future meeting, the subcommittee will be considering changes to the lease adjusted debt service coverage ratio measure, which are identified on this and subsequent slides. It is anticipated that at the next meeting on November 8th, the subcommittee will consider changes to the average daily membership measure, which, as you guessed it, are identified on this and subsequent slides. The next 4 slides were included to let stakeholders know about other items that the subcommittee will be discussing at future meetings. We could click through to the sunset audit one. In September 2023, the Arizona Auditor General issued its performance audit and sunset review of the board. The sunset audit included one finding, which pertained to the financial framework. The finding recommended the board add measures that assess financial health across multiple years, as well as make changes to the average daily membership measure. This slide identifies the anticipated timeline for considering the sunset audit's recommendations. 2 of the items are on today's agenda for the subcommittee's consideration. I am available for questions.
Andrea,
Yes.
you do such a nice job. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Member Miller, I am sorry about this, but I did pass over agenda item B, which is the introduction of subcommittee members and the technical panel. And so we are going to have to take a motion to move that item to after the general overview. And then I will quickly introduce all of you and our technical panel.
No worries. I move to relocate item B after item D on this agenda.
Second.
Member Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Stratton, Mr. Stratton, Mr. Swanson,
Aye.
Superintendent Designee Miller.
Aye.
Motion passes with majority.
Before we transition out of general overview, is it possible, you may not have it available right now, but is it possible to hear the language that's in the statute that governs having this framework? I know that this framework was developed to satisfy a ARS.
Superintendent Designee, may we do the introductions first and then go back to, I'm so sorry.
No worries. Of course.
Okay, so just as a brief intro, we do have our 4 members that have volunteered to be on this financial subcommittee. And that is Superintendent Designee Miller, Mr. Ruiz, Mr. Stratton, and Mr. Swanson, all with incredible expertise on the finance side and also as a charter operator. We also have 3 folks that have volunteered to help this subcommittee in providing technical assistance or just information as to how certain things may actually impact charter finances or reporting to the board. And those 3 people are Kevin Camber, John Snyder, and Heather Jones. And they are here for you. They are here for board members to ask any questions that you may have. And Kevin is participating virtually. And
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Kevin. I'll pass it back to Andrea to move.
To your question, ARS 15183R states that the sponsoring entity of a charter school shall have oversight and administrative responsibility for the charter schools that it sponsors. In implementing its oversight and administrative responsibilities, the sponsor shall ground its actions in evidence of the charter holder's performance in accordance with the performance framework adopted by the sponsor. The performance framework shall be publicly available, shall be placed on the sponsoring entity's website, and shall include 1, the academic performance expectations of the charter school and the measurement of sufficient progress towards the academic performance expectations. 2, the operational expectations of the charter school, including adherence to all applicable laws and obligations of the charter contract. 3, the financial expectations of the charter school. And 4, intervention and improvement policies.
Thank you so much. Thank you also to our technical panel for your willingness to help us out. Is it appropriate that we would pause and allow John and Heather and Kevin to introduce themselves and their area of expertise quickly?
Thank you. I'm John Snyder. I, until very recently, 3 weeks ago, was a managing director with RBC Capital Markets in their municipal markets division, where for almost 25 years, I led our charter school bond finance group, created it and led that group. It was until very recently, because I chose to retire after 35 years, I wasn't asked to leave. Just to be clear, I'm also a longtime board member of Arizona School for the Arts. It's my pleasure to serve.
Hi, I'm Heather Jones. I've been in the charter industry for 20 years now, and I've been the president of Aspire Business Consultants for 11. I work with charter schools of all sizes and I guess expertise in the area, and just do accounting services and audit preps and all that good stuff.
My name's Kevin Camberg. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but we're actually in the middle of issuing the November 15th deadline audits. I'm an audit partner with Fester and Chapman. We do about 120 audits. Some of those are networks, so that's a little misleading. But I've been doing charter audits since 2001, I believe. So I've worked with big, small, medium, all size charters. My kids went to charter schools, and I'm a big proponent.
Thank you all so much. We're so grateful to have your time and expertise to help guide this process. I'm not certain if we're on item B or item D.
I believe we're moving on to item E.
Okay.
Unrestricted days liquidity formula.
Okay. Before we moved on, I did fail to ask if there was any questions. I don't know if I can go backwards, but just for the general overview, if there were any questions or comments from our in-person or our Zoom attendees. So moving on to item E, the unrestricted days liquidity formula.
Subcommittee members, the charter contract requires all charter holders comply with generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP. Around the same time as the board finalized its current financial framework, changes were implemented to GAAP that required not-for-profit entities to disclose information about their liquidity in the notes to their financial statements. To more closely align the calculation with the GAAP note disclosure found in most charter holders' audits, Staff is proposing changes to the formula used to calculate charter holders' performance on the framework's unrestricted days liquidity measure. The proposed formula has been included on the next slide for today's meeting. We'll bring up that slide momentarily. The formula would consider charter holders' unrestricted cash, government funding receivables, and unrestricted current investments. Staff believes including amounts due from government entities and certain investments more accurately and fairly represents the resources available to the charter holder. With these changes, unused credit line balances and bond reserves for general operating expenses would no longer be considered other sources of liquidity, meaning that staff would no longer enter those amounts when determining a charter holder's performance. As with the current calculation, the charter holder's year-end classroom site fund carryover balance and any restricted cash identified as a current asset on the face of the audited statement of financial position or balance sheet will be removed to arrive at unrestricted cash. Please note that today's discussion focuses on the formula's numerator and does not address non-cash expenses, which are part of the formula's denominator. If as part of the subcommittee's future deliberations on the framework's adjusted net income measure, changes are made to what is considered non-cash expense, then those changes will be incorporated in the unrestricted days liquidity formula as well. I'm available for questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Can you expand just a little bit on the, this is thick, but one question I have is just on the government funding receivables. I see that those are not in current formula and are proposed to be included in new formula. So knowing grants management with having handled grants management a lot myself, those are definitely often specific funds that need to be spent a specific way. So I just was wondering if we could talk about the proposal to change those in the formula.
Yeah, if this doesn't get to your question, please ask again. There are a couple of reasons for including this. I think part of it aligns with that liquidity disclosure in the audit. Part of it is that usually that's a timing difference for many of our schools. And it really is money that is going to be available. They are going to receive it. It's going to be available. It's just that process didn't complete itself by June 30th. So it was included to kind of more fairly represent the resources that are available to them. I can say from reviewing submissions made by charter holders that are in the intervention process, most of them believe it's already included. So while I have not received written comment on that, many of your schools also believe that government funding receivables would be considered in the terms of the current framework, other liquidity that's available to them. I'm not sure if that gets to your question or not.
It does. Does our technical review panel have any feedback on these proposed changes?
Yes, thank you. Andrea, can you repeat the two items that I heard one I know was that are being excluded now that were in the formula previously? One of them was undrawn line of credit.
Yeah, and the second one, in addition to those unused credit line balances, the other one is those bond reserves that have been identified to cover general operating expenses.
All right, thank you. And I'll just note that in the bond world and the private financing world, those are generally excluded as well because they're considered to be one-time funds. If they're drawn, they're not there for an ongoing support base. So that's consistent with my world.
May I? I think including the government fund receivables is an excellent idea because sometimes you just can't get on the same page as grants management. Maybe you're waiting on supplanting to make sure that you can still draw those funds down. So waiting till the end sometimes is a really important move. And then if you can't get grants management on the same page as your timeline, then it does go over the end. So I do think adding that is a great idea. I think when we do interventions, a lot of our reasoning and maybe explanation to Andrea is that we are waiting for that money that we've already spent. So I do think that's a great idea. And line of credit, I think if it's current, sometimes we do get to use that at the drop of a hat. Not that we want to, but it's there for making important decisions that, so that might be a little bit of a loss there. But I also think that moving the equalization payment from the 22nd to the 30th might be a little challenging in this, but anyways, that's what.
Thank you. Do any of my other subcommittee members or members of the public have any questions or feedback on this?
I did. I'm sorry. I was doing the raise your hand, but this is Kevin. Excuse me. The including the grants, I think, makes a lot of sense because those are largely cost reimbursement grants. So the schools have often already spent that money on whatever the grant's restricted for, and they're just waiting to get reimbursed. So I think it makes sense to have that. And I think it's often comes in quickly after the end of the fiscal year as well. So it's truly a reimbursement of expenses that they've already incurred.
Superintendent Designee Miller, I think you have some comments in person too.
If I have a debt service coverage ratio, does my debt service coverage ratio take the money out of this area? And actually, Kevin is my guy, so he might actually know this question as well. But as I'm looking at this, I'm trying to figure out if we purchase a new building and our debt service coverage ratio is higher at the beginning of a new mortgage, is that going to influence this? It's an excellent question. Thanks for raising it. Thanks.
I can respond. I mean, the debt service is usually straight lined. It's principal and interest. So, as you enter into them, usually it's going to be the same principal and interest throughout the life of the loan if it's a conventional loan.
Do we have any other participants online that would like to speak to this item or have questions?
Kathy, I believe you've raised your hand online.
Hi, yes, I'm Kathleen Capon, and I think it's great to add the grants receivables. However, for-profits have limited access to grant funding, and so I think by excluding the unused credit line balances would potentially hurt them by removing that. Thank you.
Thank you for that feedback. My sense is that we could secure some really valuable feedback from the field on this change. So if I don't see or hear any other comments or questions, I want to make sure we've addressed all of those.
I guess I have a question. So how have you tested this formula, you know, depending on the size of the charter school? It looked like the charter schools that were having the problems before were the smaller ones. And so I'm just wondering, have you kind of used this formula and tested it against the current portfolio and see if there's, you know, does it are certain size school charter holders going to have problems versus other ones?
At this point in time, we have not tested using this formula, but that's a great idea, and I'd be more than happy to pull a sample and have that run. And it's sounds like this may be going out for this formula, may be going out for some public comment. So bringing that back at the same time that you consider any comment that you receive from the field.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think that might be critical to understand the impact. So based upon a review of the meeting materials and the subcommittee's deliberations today, I move that the subcommittee continue its discussion and consideration of agenda item E to the December 1st, 2023 meeting of the subcommittee, and that the subcommittee take no action at this time. I further direct board staff to do testing of this formula and to solicit preliminary public comment on the proposed changes discussed today for a period of not less than 5 business days, and report the results of the public comment to the subcommittee at its December 1st, 2023 meeting.
This is Member Stratton. I will second your motion.
Mr. Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Stratton,
Aye.
Mr. Swanson, Superintendent Designee Miller.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you for that discussion. We will now move on to agenda item F, unrestricted days liquidity targets.
Subcommittee members, staff is proposing the subcommittee recommend increasing over multiple audit cycles the meet standards threshold for the framework's unrestricted days liquidity measure from 30 days to 90 days. Increasing the number of days will help ensure the board's charter holders can address needs and respond to situations as they arise, and help limit the possibility of schools being unable to make it to the end of the school year. The meeting materials include a table that details staff's proposal. A portion of that table has been included on the next slide for today's meeting. Under the proposal, the meet standard target would increase to 45 days for fiscal year 24 audits, to 60 days for the fiscal year 2025 audits, and to 90 days for the fiscal year 2027 audits. Pursuant to the policy and procedures approved by the board in October, the board will annually review the financial framework, any feedback provided, and the portfolio's performance. If it appears the timeline for implementation may need to be changed, staff will present this information to the board. Additionally, following the review of the fiscal year 2025 audits, which the board will receive in fiscal year 2026, the proposed increase to 90 days will be placed on a board agenda, so the board may reevaluate based on more recent portfolio performance data. The meeting materials include information on the portfolio's estimated performance under the proposal, and I'm available for questions.
Members, Do we have any questions at this time? Similar to Member Weese's question, Andrea, I know we're looking at a scaled in approach, but if we put our schools in this model today, have we looked at what that impact would be or where schools would fall?
Thank you. For this particular item, we did run estimated performance of the portfolio. And to determine that, we just removed all other liquidity. So, which is not where we're going to end up, but to make it simple to run the calculation. So if you're looking right now, and if you have the meeting materials in front of you, the overall performance is on page 3 of the staff report. The appendix to the staff report includes that performance by the size or the classification of the schools. In looking at the graph, the first column is just current standard. And again, that is with the other liquidity having been removed so that there is comparable data that we are looking at. At this point in time, using 22 performance results, we would currently have, and again, all other liquidity has been removed, which will not be the case when we actually do the calculation. We are looking at approximately, say, 88-ish% of the portfolio would meet on the increase to 45 days. We have about 74% that would be meeting right now on the increase to 60 days. And we would have roughly 60% that would be meeting on the increase to 90 days. Again, that is a calculation that is done looking purely at the charter holders' unrestricted cash and does not include any of the liquidity that was, I guess, is currently considered under the framework or any of the items that we previously discussed at the last agenda item.
Thank you for that.
Another thing that might be important to point out is that those numbers also reflect the options that you see in the proposal or on the slide in front of you. So that is not only having 45 days or 60 days or 90 days, but there is also a range that the charter holder can have that is under that top threshold, but is showing improvement. And that would also put them in the meets category, or there is also a similar option in the approaches standard.
Questions or comments from public members, committee members, or technical panel?
Yeah, I have a comment on this, and I work with a lot of smaller charters, and to get to 90 days is going to be a struggle. 30 days was okay when we had 2 payments in June, but now that it's spread out more evenly and we only have 1 payment in June on the 22nd, it could be a little more difficult to meet these standards. Although I think it's an amazing idea to have 90 days cash on hand, when we strive for that, even in when I was working with the Charter School Association and dealing with brand new charters, they had a 10% contingency plan on savings. So, I mean, sometimes we even strive to meet that. So I think this is going to be really difficult. And I also think that there's going to be a lot more schools, especially with only having 1 measure fall into intervention, that you're going to require a lot of the littler schools to fall into that. And it's the bigger schools that have, charter networks behind them can loan to one another where little schools cannot. So I really think this is going to hurt schools rather than help.
Thank you for those comments.
I agree with Heather. I think this is, moving it up from the current levels is advisable in my mind, and will make it more in line with what private financing market standards are. But these are actually exceed those. Typically, we see covenants for bond issues. Historically, it's been more 45 days. More recently, it's been pushed to 60 days, but not higher than that. And so going to 90, while it'd be wonderful to have everyone at that level and provide a level of cushion that would be terrific. It's going to be well in excess of what the market would generally look for. And my other concern, just practically, is these implementation dates seem, for someone to effectively be in compliance in 2024 audit of 45 days, have to double the amount of cash in 3 years. Sounds like a real lift that could be challenging.
Thank you for that. Yeah, coming up.
Okay, so.
All right. I want to kind of echo what we're hearing already. So we're a single site charter at Western School of Science and Technology. We're completely in the green right now. However, a couple concerns. When we shared that only about 60% or so are meeting with the 2022 numbers, if we were to apply these, that we still have COVID funds. That's your number with COVID funds still out there in the field. So that's concerning to me. Two, I'm just wondering how this takes into account what we're facing of not increasing funding from the state and cost of living increases. So my cost to put a good teacher in my building is doubled in the past 3 to 4 years. And so raising the bar for how much money I need to save while almost how much money I need to spend to actually produce at my school. For example, my school information system this year went from $5,000 to $30,000 for a single site. So I feel like this formula is going to make me choose between keeping my charter or having money to instruct kids. And I don't feel good about that choice. There's not enough money in the market right now to do this. If we increase funding for schools in general, great. But we're kind of scraping by as it is. And then I guess my question is what's the original problem this is trying to address? Because I think what I heard is charters closing mid-year, and I'm behind getting that so that families have consistency. I don't think this is the way to necessarily ensure families have consistency, only because I think a lot of us are going to show up in the red now just based on trying to continue to educate our students. So.
Thank you so much for those comments. I'm a single site school as well, so I can feel the passion. I'm wondering, Ashley, if I believe this was mentioned in our sunset audit. Maybe you could speak to that just a little bit.
Andrew, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this specifically was not mentioned in the sunset audit. However, this measure is pretty consistent to what other authorizers have around the country. And so we really based this recommendation off of what the National Association for Charter School Authorizers puts out as best practice. And so where NACSA, or National Charter Association for Charter School Authorizers, is at the increase to 60 days. So board staff did go above and beyond in requiring the 90, but the 60 days is where the best practices lays for authorizers. So that's really where this is coming from. And this is, one of those areas where we have heard from a variety of stakeholders that the bar that we maybe have set at this point currently is too low. So that's really where it's coming from.
Thank you for elaborating. Deanna, did I see you raise your hand to speak?
Chair Miller, this is Lynn Adams too, if I can speak at some point.
Yes, please, Lynn. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to echo the comments by both Heather and John. I really am concerned about the impact of this increased measure on single charter schools. I think it may be great for some charter schools, but if we really want to, as a state, to have a wide spectrum of options for parents, I think we need to realize we need to take a look at the impact again on all charter schools, including very small Montessori schools, which are doing amazing work. And I think this is going to impact them, particularly as Heather said, given the changes in funding dates for schools. And I have a concern if only 60% of our charters would be meeting this, adopting a measure that would put 40% into intervention really does concern me quite significantly. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Are there others on Zoom? Member Ruiz?
Yeah, thank you. Being a small business, cash flow and everything is critical. I've heard two comments, one from the gentleman, I think his name is Kevin, is there, was saying that this, we're starting to get where we're exceeding what the private industry would require to have cash on hand. And then the other thing was another woman before him spoke about the state changing the timing of payments from two payments in a month versus now it's one. We can't. I as a small bit private industry, I could go to my customer who owes me and say, hey, give me I'll give you a 1% discount if you pay me now. And I could pull money in to kind of make stuff work. But the way the state runs, I mean, they can change, timing of payments and there's nothing really that as I see it working, how it works, there's nothing that a charter school, a charter operator could do to pull in payments from their customers to manage this. So I'd like to study this a little bit more.
Thank you, Member Ruiz.
Madam Chair, this is Member Stratton. I just have a couple of comments. I echo some of the same concerns that Member Ruiz just mentioned and the others. I just think that this proposal, we need to kind of step back a little bit maybe and study the impact of this because going to such a high level of cash on hand, while it is it is obviously a good thing to have that security, that extra cash in the bank, it really, I think, could adversely impact our mid to small size charter schools. And I want to make sure that whatever we're doing here is actually helping and not causing more issues or hindrances. So that's my first my first impression when taking a look at this. That's all.
Thank you so much for that. Come on up.
Just maybe a response or a question for Ashley. When you shared that those are the national standards, I think that's great that we always look at like what everyone's doing. I wonder if the states that are using that effectively, what their funding formula is for their schools coming out of the state though. So if they can maintain 60 or 90 days liquidity, are they also being funded at a higher rate from there? So if there was any comparison to that, like if I'm in a state that really values education monetarily speaking, maybe that's easier for me to maintain 60 or 90 days. And I'm not sure if we looked at that.
No, Jessica, to your point, we did not look at what the funding models are for those other states. I would assume that because Arizona is so low, that most of those states would be having more funding for those students in their schools. Just a few questions for maybe the board members so that board staff can have some direction going forward on how we can maybe change or update this recommendation. Would it I think we take it like one year at a time. So maybe looking at FY 2024, are board members comfortable with that year? And then maybe moving on to the next FY 2025, just so we can understand really where the true concern is, to better provide information to you going forward.
I think for me, based on what I'm hearing, it would still be helpful to look at a several years phase in, but I'm definitely getting the sentiment that we should be looking at perhaps 60 days by the 2027, running maybe some numbers on that, seeing what impact that would have. I think another area that really needs to be addressed in looking at this agenda item based on the concern and the number of schools that would fall outside is, what does that intervention piece look like? Does it need to be this intervention on our dashboard, or do we need more of an internal measure where charter board staff can assist schools that may be trending in a negative direction? And trends is something that's really missing from this. These items over a few years tell us a lot more than they do in 1 year as far as having high stakes for intervention. Other members, and I'm so sorry, I can't see the members that are online. So please don't be shy if you've been waiting to make a comment, and it might be helpful to introduce yourself when you do, since the members in person can't see you. So I'd like to put that question that Ashley had out to other subcommittee members and members of the public.
Wendy, this is Steve Duran. I was looking at it too, but I have some questions I think we could look at too. Is that cash, that could be a long-term loan, or a loan that's going into that cash now. So I think that's one of the things that we need to discuss, is how is that liquidity derived as well? Because if I'm just going to my bank and getting a loan and then using that for operating capital, I think that's different than if that's cash that I'm holding, that is a net revenue that we're holding as a school. So I think those are two different things, and I think it's obviously more beneficial to the long-term viability of charters if that cash is internally derived, not borrowed funds. So I think that might be part of this measure that we're looking at as well, is not just do we have 60 days or 90 days or 45 days or 30 days worth of liquidity, but where is that liquidity derived from?
Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you. I'd like to just to put maybe a more practical point, at least back of the envelope, on the implementation and phasing, which is, my biggest concern about this. We pick the level that we think we need to get to and compare it to whatever the other standards are, but how do you get from A to Z? I would tell you that we know from our experience in financing charter schools, most of them are paying between 10 and 20% of their budget for facilities. We also know that we have a coverage ratio that, wants us to target 20% excess on that cost of your facility, so 1.2 times. If you were to pick the midpoint of that 10 to 20, sort of the average, let's just say, and you need a 20% buffer on that to meet that standard, that's 3%. 3% of a 365-day budget is 10 days of cash. So you could be meeting your debt service coverage ratio, creating 10 days worth of cash per year, and you're trying to get from 45 to 60 or 90 in 3 years, not going to be possible. And that then assumes you're not spending any money on capital maintenance, stuff that you would otherwise use some of your excess cash to make sure your facilities are still usable and presentable, and et cetera, et cetera. So, I think we need to think through, or I think there needs to be some thought put into how you get to point Z, whatever point Z is, in a practical fashion that does not inhibit schools from also doing other things that they really need to do with that cash.
Thank you, John. I think it's important too, in context, what is the end goal? What is the charter board hoping to achieve by establishing the 90 days? Please, Heather, go ahead and jump in.
Thank you. I also want to point out that we're talking about making this change in FY24, which we're already well, almost 5 months into. And so I think that raising it 15 days cash level when by the time these decisions are made is not going to be attainable for some.
Thank you. Do we have other comments or questions online? Anybody here have other thoughts on this one? I definitely feel that there's, great concern that this will harm, not help our schools. So I would like to I would move that the subcommittee continue its discussion and consideration of agenda item F to the next meeting of the subcommittee, and that the subcommittee take no action at this time.
I'll second that motion. This is Member Stratton.
Mr. Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Stratton,
Aye.
Mr. Swanson, Superintendent Designee Miller.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you. I appreciate too as we look at this item at the next subcommittee meeting, if we can dig into a few of the comments suggested today as far as impacts and alternatives.
Will do. Are there any specific things that you would like to make sure that staff has looked into, or that we can report out on at the next meeting?
Sure. Thank you for that clarification. I think a decreased number of days seems to be a important sentiment. A longer phase-in period, eliminating fiscal year 2024 sounds to be critical. And perhaps a little larger discussion surrounding the why, a little more understanding of why this is being recommended. Is there any other that I've forgotten, members, that you would like Andrea to look into? Okay, thank you so much. I think we are prepared to move on to agenda item G, the sunset audit recommendations.
Subcommittee members, both items under agenda item G stem from the performance audit and sunset review of the board issued by the Arizona Auditor General in September. Among other things, the sunset audit recommended the board add measures that assess charter holders' financial health across multiple years. One of those measures is the general fund to operating reserve ratio, which is used by the Auditor General in its school district financial risk analysis. The meeting materials include information on the operating reserve ratio and the board's current unrestricted days liquidity measure. I'm available for questions.
Members, do we have questions?
Superintendent Designee Miller, if this helps with the discussion, really what board staff is looking is for the subcommittee to potentially determine whether you want to replace the unrestricted days liquidity measure with the Assistant Attorney or Auditor General's Office, operating reserve ratio, or whether the changes already being considered to the unrestricted days liquidity measure targets are sufficient.
Does our technical panel have thoughts surrounding this suggestion by the Auditor General's Office?
For me, I'm not sure what the Auditor General defines as general fund. It sounds like an accrual kind of concept, which is one of the things that in 2018 we wanted to move away from for the types of, the business operations of charter schools, which are different from district schools. Now I could be wrong about that, but that word or that term is not really clear to me what it means. And I think that this is about liquidity, I think the measures that that have been suggested here today are very much aligned with private market and have worked in that world. And I'm not sure there needs to be anything else other than that.
Thank you, John. Yeah, sometimes I feel like it's apples to oranges. Our audits are so in-depth and comprehensive. Do we have other comments or questions on this agenda item?
This is Kevin. General fund is a governmental term. Do you know what is the formula for general fund operating reserve ratio?
The formula that they identified is general fund ending balance divided by general fund total expenditures.
Yeah, I mean, so governments operate in a different GAAP basis of accounting where they break their operations into funds, and general fund would be like the main operating fund. But that's not a term that nonprofits or for-profits or a method of accounting that is even applicable to a nonprofit or for-profit. So I think what we're doing now makes a lot more sense just because of the type of entities we're talking about, nonprofits and for-profits, as opposed to, traditional school districts that are governments.
Thank you, Kevin. I agree wholeheartedly. Are there other comments or feedback?
This is Steve Durand. I think we would need an example to look at it. It would be to use an AFR and look at how this would actually play out before we could. I agree that we don't know exactly what it looks like. I think I understand it. I think it's those two lines that are on your AFR at the bottom and how that would go into your expenditures. But I'd like to see an example of it for a school before we could even see how it would impact us.
Thank you, Steve. Are there any other comments? I think that we're asking a lot of board staff to prepare for this subcommittee. So it's just my opinion that this effort on this particular item may not be fruitful. So I'd like to suggest a motion. Based upon a review of the meeting materials and the subcommittee's deliberations, I move the subcommittee recommend to the full board that the operating reserve measure not be added to the financial performance framework for reasons that it is inapplicable or more applicable to a government agency. The operating reserve ratio and the financial framework's current unrestricted days liquidity measure capture similar information and are easier to understand in our context.
I'll second that motion. This is Member Stratton.
Member Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Stratton,
Aye.
Mr. Swanson, Superintendent Designee Miller.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Number 2 on the sunset audit recommendations was the inclusion of cash flow measure.
Subcommittee members, the sunset audit also recommended adding a cash flow measure. The meeting materials include information on the cash flow measure options identified by the Auditor General, as well as information on the cash flow measure that was previously part of the board's financial framework, and on changes that the subcommittee will be discussing in the future that will strengthen the framework's evaluation of charter holders' cash position. I'm available for questions.
How would this, in your opinion, differ from the ways we're monitoring cash now in the framework?
I think the big thing, and one of the things that the Auditor General's possibly one of the main reasons they recommended this was that it looks over time, where our current unrestricted days liquidity measure just focuses on the current year. And even as proposed under the previous discussions that we've had, we would really be at this time only expanding that to look at the prior year in just limited circumstances. So I think their big reason for that was to get something that looked at more years. And that was kind of where they were coming from, I think.
Thank you. Just go ahead.
To your earlier discussion about the unrestricted days liquidity measure, it is possible. I haven't thought through all of it, but since we're going to kind of be bringing that back and looking at it some more, I suppose it is possible that, and to the point that you raised during that discussion, that we could include more years in determining performance on that measure, or consider more than just the audit year and maybe the prior year. That maybe could be looking at more trends, as you discussed previously.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I do think that there's opportunity there, and also in our adjusted net income and debt service ratios, to be looking at trends prior to interventions as a nonprofit. If we are responsible and we use our reserve in a year that we are breaking even or a little below, that should not, in my opinion, take us into intervention. So I do think it's very important that we start looking at some of these measures in a multi-year format prior to intervention. I don't necessarily think that this recommendation is where we do it. I would think we need to do it on our other measures. But I'd like to open it up for other comments on this agenda item.
Yes, Chairman Miller, I would agree with you. I think that it is key that the board looks at negative trends, ones that might give you some foresight into a problem that is developing and might need to be addressed before it becomes a revocation or other more serious remedy, and that those things should be captured by some of those other year-to-year ongoing measures. My concern about the measures that were outlined here for potential consideration is one that, oftentimes the schools will build cash over time in anticipation of a large capital expenditure, in anticipation of a new programmatic investment that could be then a drawdown on their cash. And I don't think a school in those cases should be held in a negative light, especially if they are meeting every other measure, including some floor, whether it's 45, 60, 90, wherever we come out on that, of days cash on hand after such draw. It looks like under this, if you just draw down your cash, even if you're still at 150 days, you have the potential to have a negative tick against you. So, I do think the other measures help capture and will capture trends. If we're to use a year-to-year change in cash balances or liquidity balances, I think there needs to be exceptions for certain types of draws and I think a floor before it's even considered an issue.
Thank you, John. I agree. Please come on up.
Thank you. I think I want to echo something similar, which is just, with the pandemic dollars, especially right now, we were able to save a significant amount of money, knowing that spending that money over the next couple of years was going to be of best benefit to our students when they were really back in front of us and ready. And so we made a plan to do that. But under this, if I, for the next couple of years, have a not positive cash flow because I am spending down my reserves, which I had planned to do over the next few years, now I would be dinged for that as what it sounds like is being irresponsible with finances, but I would really call that very responsible to build up a reserve and then to spend it with a plan in mind. And so I don't know what the solution is other than, I know that plan. I'm happy to submit it if the board needs to know how that I'm intentionally going to not have a positive cash flow. So thank you.
Thank you. I think that's one of the real risks in some of these measures is forgetting that we're intended to be nonprofits and were intended to ebb and flow. And when you look at a snapshot from one year to another, you're not factoring in decisions to buy a building, sell a building, invest in a student program. So responsible agencies that have cash on hand sometimes want to use it and don't want to then take out a line of credit to meet a measure. So I really appreciate those comments. Do we have any questions or comments from our online participants?
This is Kevin. I wanted to echo, just at least if you met a minimum, regardless if you went down, I think that's important, whatever that minimum the board decides on, because the nonprofits do have that ebb and flow where they accumulate assets and then, they expand or they have, something consistent with their mission. And so the cash, they're not accumulating cash like a for-profit would to disperse to shareholders. It's there for a purpose usually. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Well, and frankly, if it has gone down due to a slight decline in performance, creating this high stakes dashboard measure potentially can only maybe further that negative, interest rates are higher, public attention on the dashboard finding can actually make the problem worse. Other comments or feedback?
Wendy, this is Steve Durand. I do believe, I agree with you and I agree with other people that the number one thing charter schools should try to keep from happening is incurring debt to meet a measure. I think debt is the last thing we want to do. If we have cash on hand, if we've been able to save cash and reserve cash for planning to purchase a building or planning to purchase a playground or whatever those things are, that is the best use of those funds, far better than a measure that would arbitrarily be better for us to borrow money that we already have to do that same thing, so that not to push a measure. So I think this is where debt and assets and how we spend our cash really matters. And I think any of the measures that we do that we want to show fiscal responsibility through using the cash that we've accumulated for an educational purpose or for a building purpose or whatever the case may be, I think that's a good thing, and we should never be penalized for that.
Well said. Thank you so much. I had some notes in the materials, Andrea or Ashley, that spoke to the removal of this measure in the past. Is it possible just to elaborate on that briefly?
Absolutely. When the board initially adopted its financial framework back in 2012, they did include a cash flow measure. A lot of the measures that were used in that were modeled after kind of the overall framework that the National Association of Charter School Authorizers had developed. And so there were various ways to meet and not meet and different calculations. So in 2012, that was initially added. In 2016, the board simplified the measure to just focus on whether the cash flow was positive or negative, after finding all the considerations of the annual cash flow didn't really add much value, but a lot of complexity. But in 2018, so your predecessors who developed the framework that we are looking at now, in 2018, their recommendation to the full board was not to include the cash flow measure. And that was to some of the points that were being raised today, that based on the 7 audit cycles that the board had this measure in place in various forms, they found that the measure penalized charter holders that were acting responsibly and could have rewarded those who were struggling. And so in the end, they decided that they would not include a cash flow measure. And earlier this year, NACSA released its updated framework, and it does not include a cash flow measure.
Thank you for that. Do we have any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I move that based upon a review of the meeting materials and the subcommittee's deliberations, that the subcommittee recommend to the full board that a cash flow measure not be added to the financial performance framework for reasons that the board's 2012 financial framework included a cash flow measure, which was in place for 7 audit cycles. As part of the 2018 financial framework overhaul, the cash flow measure was eliminated as it penalizes charter holders acting responsibly and may reward those who are struggling.
I'll second that motion. This is Member Stratton.
Thank you. Member Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Stratton,
Aye.
Mr. Swanson, Superintendent Designee Miller.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Do I need an emotion for a 5-minute restroom break?
No, we can go ahead and take a 5-minute break.
Great. Thank you so much. So we'll reconvene in 5 minutes. All right, I believe we are ready to move on to agenda item H regarding default.
I'll do a quick roll call just to make sure that we have quorum. Mr. Ruiz,
Here.
thank you. Mr. Stratton,
Here.
Mr. Swanson, Superintendent Designee Miller.
Here.
Thank you. You have a quorum.
Subcommittee members, failure to make timely payments or comply with other requirements may result in a lender or landlord issuing a notice of default. The framework's default measure considers the absence or presence of certain disclosure regarding whether the charter holder is in default on loans or facility agreements. Staff is proposing adding an approaches standard option to the default measure. As proposed by staff, the option would address a situation where the lender or landlord has allowed the charter holder to pause or reduce payments for a period of time under a forbearance or similar agreement. I'm available for questions.
Members, do we have questions for Andrea on this item? Do we have any? Yep, please jump in.
I had a, so if a landlord offers a forbearance, how does that then roll into their other financial, how does that roll into the other financial measures that you look at, that the value of that forbearance and how it's going to get paid back?
I can say that in the past, we've had this come up twice with our schools, and regardless of the charter holders' default measure performance, both of those charter holders had below standard ratings on one or more of the other measures, likely because the forbearance agreement in these particular cases resulted from the charter holders being unable to make payments. And since they were unable to make payments, that kind of crossed over into other areas of their performance. And so they did have below standard ratings. Kind of the reason that this is coming up now is because for those two schools, let me back up. When the board initially adopted its framework back in 2012, there was a lot of discussion about how to handle that relationship between the school and their lender or landlord, and what role, if any, the board should have. And the board at that time decided that their responses would be based on the lender. At that time, it was just the lenders. Since then, we've added the facility agreements, but the lender and landlord's response. And so kind of stemming from that, the forbearance agreement was viewed as, while we've sort of escalated things in that charter holder situation, the landlord or lender is still okay. They've decided we're still willing to work with this school. And so for those two schools in the past that had this, they got a meet standard on the rating. And that seemed like that was not completely representing that charter holder's position. So the proposal is to make it an approach to standard. But like I mentioned before, regardless of their performance on the going concern measure, or excuse me, on the default measure, even if we gave them a meets, that situation that resulted in them having the forbearance agreement kind of rippled through everything else. And so they were in intervention anyway, at least in those two situations.
Thank you for the explanation.
Other questions, comments on the default?
Chairman Miller. I think this move is absolutely appropriate to recognize that forbearance agreement is a step, a negative step versus relative to being in good standing under the default measure. In fact, I could potentially argue that if you're in forbearance, which in my mind is largely just a default workout, you should move right to that step. But I think this is a good interim solution to recognize schools that are struggling in that fashion and keep a closer eye on them as to whether they can work out of that pending default situation.
Yeah, thank you, John. I agree. Sometimes this measure comes too late, right? Other comments, questions? Anyone online want to speak to this? Since we have a smaller crowd, I think it would be beneficial to receive feedback from the field before making this final decision. So based upon a review of the meeting materials and the subcommittee's deliberations, I move that the subcommittee continue its discussion and consideration of agenda item H to the December 1st, 2023 meeting of the subcommittee, and that the subcommittee take no action at this time. I further direct board staff to solicit preliminary public comment on the proposed changes discussed today for a period of not less than 5 business days and report the results of the public comment to the subcommittee at its December 1st, 2023 meeting.
I'll second that motion. This is Member Stratton.
Mr. Ruiz,
I'm going to vote no. I feel that it's reason. The only reason I'm saying that is I feel it's reasonable as written. So I'm going to just vote no.
Mr. Stratton,
I'll vote yes.
Mr. Swanson,
Yes.
Superintendent Designee Miller,
Yes.
motion passes.
Moving on to agenda item I, going concern.
Can I make a comment?
Of course.
Sorry,
Yes.
I came back to the meeting in the middle of this discussion, but having read the motion, I feel like it's really just a continuation of the discussion, and I feel like I was okay to vote in that manner. So, but if anybody has an objection with my voting not having been through the full discussion, please let me know.
Thank you, Jim.
It's okay at this point, but I don't know if you want to have additional discussion, maybe present a new motion, or if you want to keep going forward. It would be best, Jim, if you want to change your vote, that we would need to present a new motion. Or do you want to keep your vote?
No, I think the motion was fine. I don't think we need to do a new motion.
Oh, okay.
All right. Thank you, Member Swanson. I appreciate that. It's nice to have you back. Moving on to agenda item I, going concern.
Subcommittee members, accounting principles require charter holder management to evaluate their entity's ability to continue operating. Under audit standards, the charter holder's independent CPA then audits the conclusion reached by management. The framework's going concern measure considers the absence or presence of certain disclosure related to the review by management and the independent CPA. Staff is proposing no changes to the going concern measure. This item has been placed on the agenda to allow the subcommittee to receive public comment from stakeholders. I'm available for questions.
Did we have any prior public comment come in on the going concern?
We did not.
Members, do you have question or comment on this measure? My sense on the going concern measure is that it ties back to measures within our audit that are being evaluated and other measures on the financial framework. And since auditors at times view these items differently, I do believe that this measure has an angle of potential subjectivity to it. So I don't know if the technical panel wants to speak to that or has that same sense.
This is Kevin. Going concern is a subjective determination. I do think it's important that if a school has that it's disclosed on the dashboard, though. It's it's not done lightly, between management and the auditor to include that in the notes or in the audit opinion. It's it's definitely a red flag, although there is no black and white criterion. It's subjective determination.
Thank you, Kevin. Does board staff know how often a going concern, and I'm sorry if this was in the materials, for the schools that have closed or been closed, were going concerns noted?
I don't have that information readily available, but I can get that information.
Thanks. Any other comments? Yes, please, Heather.
I was just gonna say, I definitely agree with it being in the dashboard or the framework, because the auditors are going in and they're looking at things in a detailed manner, even by sample process. And so, yes, it is subjective, but there's reasons for that. And I feel like even though it's black and white almost in a sense, that they would do that. And there's conversation with management regarding it. And like Kevin said, it's not taken lightly. So I definitely agree with it being in there.
Do you agree with it going directly to the I feel like falls far below, I'm saying testing testing terms, the red? Do you agree with it going directly to the red? Do you feel like it would ever be appropriate for it to fall into approaches?
It could be, depending on what the situation is. I was just saying earlier that, we used to it wasn't just black and white with numbers. We used to have a narrative process to explain some situations so that there was reasons behind why we were doing what we were doing. It just wasn't reflective on the numbers. So I think back in the day when we had to do this in the very beginning and write to why we had this in our audit report, we could specify what it was. So do I think it should go directly to the red? Maybe if we're watching but I do think it could be for many different reasons why this is being put in. So it could be either, I guess. I mean, I know that's not much help, but.
No, I appreciate you elaborating. Yeah.
It just so people are clear, the determination is a year from when the audit is issued that you have concern about them, being able to stay in business. Yeah, I think it's appropriate to go to red because it's a pretty, it's a pretty big deal to get that in your audit opinion.
Real quick, Member Swanson, do you have?
Thank you, Superintendent Designee Miller. Kevin kind of just said what I wanted to say, that a going concern opinion, although subjective, is never one that's taken lightly by an auditor. And it is a massively important thing. And we would be not doing our job if we did not put them immediately into the red and take additional action to monitor the school.
Thank you.
I wanted to speak, I think, to what you had mentioned, which is, the subjectivity of it. And I would argue that as a school, I also have the option of picking my auditing company. So, I mean, I get some measure of like access to switch that accounting company if I think that there is something that is not fairly being recorded in that section. And so I think that allows schools a little bit of choice. One, I guess, thought or question I have is I remember a few years ago, we took off some auditors from the list of approved auditors. And I only remember this because the school I was working with at the time, when I was with the Charter School Association, they used an auditor that was not on the approved list. So I am just wondering if a school automatically goes into the red and then we later remove that auditing firm from being able to audit, would that subjective measure be taken off, or is there any way to account for that if the auditing firm was found to not be meeting the measures that people needed?
Just to clarify that, we don't necessarily have like an approved list of auditors. Like there isn't a set standard that auditors are required to. It's really that they're in good standing. And so I believe maybe potentially you got into a situation where an auditor was no longer able to do or in good standing with the accountancy board. Yeah. And so that's really the only time when they're not in good standing with the accountancy board, that they would not be able to do an audit. But you're absolutely correct, Jessica, that as a charter, you are able to choose your auditors, and the board and board staff really has no say in that unless if they're not in good standing. Yep.
Yeah. So then if the committee would consider that if we find out that an auditing firm is no longer in good standing, that maybe that subjective measure would either be removed or re-reviewed by someone else based on the fact that that accounting firm couldn't do the audit anymore.
Thank you for that feedback. Coming up, Deanna.
Sorry. I'm going to address this just from an outsider perspective, knowing some of the backstory, and these guys probably wouldn't share it because they're too professional to do so. If in fact an auditor is removed from a list because they are no longer in good standing, it would be because they were over supportive of a poor performing school rather than under supportive of a poor performing school. So while there may be some subjectivity there, I think they would have weighed in the favor of the school initially, as opposed to the converse. So I'm not sure that would be necessary.
Thank you for that.
And I'll just add, I don't know the exact standards, although I know that the accountants and the audits we look at that take those opinions very seriously. I can tell you, when I receive financial statements for schools who are submitting to me to finance, the very first thing I do is read what the auditor's opinion is. And if there was a going concern, I'd close it and we wouldn't do a financing. And so I think the level at which, the board views that determination, given that it is given with, with a lot of consideration under professional standards that are, that there is some qualitative element to, but in the practical world, it's a death knell. And it should be, I think, in the way that, the charge that this board has to oversee its schools and make sure that those kids are not going to be, left out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Superintendent Designee Miller. Just going back to one of your original questions regarding the number of schools that may be potentially closed with a going concern. Although we do not have that data, we do have information as to how many of our charters are actually receiving going concerns over the last couple of years that were identified for intervention. So if we look back to FY19, we had 5 schools, FY20, 7, and then FY21, make sure I'm on the right line, 4, and then the most recent FY22 there were 0. So I think to the technical panel's comments, like it is not taken lightly when an auditor does identify a school with a going concern.
And just to clarify, those numbers reflect those charters where only the going concern measure was the only reason they were in intervention. The staff report for this materials indicate that about 1% of your portfolio had a going concern below standard rating in 2022. So that's what, maybe like 4-ish. But they also would have had other measures because there were none that just had that measure.
Not knowing all the details, I hesitate, but it sounds like, thank you is in order for those interventions that have lessened the number of schools experiencing this measure now, that we're this many years into the financial framework. Any other comments online regarding the going concern measure? Hearing none, I will make this motion based upon our review of the meeting materials and the subcommittee's deliberations. Comments made today. I move that the subcommittee recommend that the board make no changes to the going concern measure as currently set forth in the financial performance framework.
I'll second that motion. This is Member Stratton.
Member Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Stratton,
Aye.
Mr. Swanson,
Aye.
Superintendent Designee Miller.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you. Item J, public comment regarding future items for consideration by the Financial Framework Subcommittee.
I would ask that the subcommittee consider the current threshold for the ADM decrease if a school has a specific reason that they're looking to decrease their ADM. Specifically, if we're doing kind of a revamp of programming, or right now for Western, it's one of the things that we're considering for next year. We have a pretty large reserve, but what we don't have is a lot of teachers with a lot of experience. And so being able to decrease my ADM, to decrease the student class sizes, to help onboard new teachers to ensure that I maintain a strong academic program is one of the things I'm considering. However, when running the numbers, the decrease that I'm looking at proposing for next year would actually fall and put us into the red category, even if we're meeting all the other standards. So just considering whether or not schools would be able to give a reason why we're doing that. We do show it on our budget, the proposed ADM. So it's like my board has already approved my plan. So I'm not sure then why I would be dinged if that was not approved by my own board.
I agree. I'd love to discuss that at a future subcommittee meeting. In general, our ADM trends across the entire state are trending down. So with such high stakes impacts for us from this financial framework, even though it does have some cushion for us as far as being able to have a little give in it, I do think it's an important conversation. I'd really like to have it. Thank you for that. Online members, what would you like to see on the future subcommittee agendas?
Superintendent Designee Miller, I'm pleased with what we've done today and what we tabled to move on for further discussion. I don't have anything to add.
Thank you, Member Swanson. A couple of items I know have already been discussed that I would enjoy the opportunity to discuss further in our future meetings are looking at some multiple year trend data for the high stakes measures of adjusted net income and debt to service coverage ratio, and considering whether those multi-years should be looked at prior to intervention. Also, looking at the intervention and probation process itself, I think would be beneficial, seeing how that has worked, or if any adjustments are needed to that at this, as we review this, this measure, this framework.
Superintendent Designee Miller, this is
Yes.
Carlos Reese. Can I,
Yes, please,
and
Member Reese.
this might be directed to Ashley, but I'd like to see some demographic data. I've spoken to the superintendent of the public school district that I live in, and he made a comment that I think it was a school facilities board has done some demographics, and his comment was the current junior year class is the largest that it's ever going to be in the state of Arizona. That the trends are down. The long-term trends for enrollment or just not enrollment. I want to say enrollment for population of children, school-aged children, is going down for Arizona. Even though there's an influx of people coming into the state, it's people that don't have children. And so, that has implications for public schools. It has implications for private schools. It has implications for our public charter schools. And I was wondering if you could find where this research is, where it resides. And I think the school facilities board might be the place that I think that originates, because I think it's just important for us to kind of keep an eye on what's going on demographically in our state as we're making some of these decisions on financing. Because if the trends are down and competition's up, it's going to be it's going to put strains on the entire system.
Amen. Member Reese, very well said. Absolutely. I believe also the Charter Association has released some studies and data on this that we could review and look at as well.
And Superintendent Designee Miller and Member Ruiz, we're happy to bring that information to you as well.
I don't know if it's realistic or there would even be time in these subcommittee meetings, but it's definitely interesting to think a bigger picture on correlations between the frameworks. Like, do we see a correlation between schools that are meeting their financial objectives as compared to their academic objectives and vice versa? I know parents would find a great deal of interest in that. And I do believe that that's one of the reasons for these dashboards, is to inform the public of our work. So I think if it's possible to look at those correlations, that would also be of great interest to many. Anyone else online have any thoughts of things they would like to have the opportunity to discuss in here? Okay. Any questions, Ashley, on clarification for? All right, then I think we will move on to agenda item K, summary of current events, future meeting dates, and items for future agendas.
Board members, at this time, no updates other than our next subcommittee meeting is going to be next week on November 8th. And we will work to get as much of this information out to the public as quickly as possible for public comment, and then bring those back to you at the December meeting. Additionally to that, we'll work on getting together some presentations for you for that November meeting on more of the context of what's going on.
Thank you. I believe then we are prepared to move on to adjournment. Do we need a motion for that? No. Okay. Thank you so much to our technical panel and all of our practitioners and board staff that have played such an important part in the conversation today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.